everybody. I would like to start today just with an acknowledgement of country. I'm presenting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I acknowledge their deep and long connection with this land that I am very lucky to be here presenting on, and my respects to their elders, past and present. So, hi, my name is Susan. Last year I did an incredibly strange thing. I started a startup, and I know that many people within tech are super keen to do startups, and I thought I'd share with you my journey here today. I am an engineer, I am a developer, I am a maker. I've been building things for way longer than I would like to admit. I've worked at companies like Mondo and PageUp, and I've also been a tech leader. So as a tech leader, there is not as many of us female tech leaders. And as I became a leader, I was not seeing a lot of people like myself. And as such, see a problem, fix a problem. I co-founded Tech Leading Ladies. And I wanted to share with you why. Up here, I've got my mission for Tech Leading Ladies, which is about bridging the gender gap in technical leadership. And that is what led me to co-founding my startup. So with startups, you're gonna have some great days and you're gonna have some really sad days. And what I'm trying to say to you is that you need to have a really strong reason for your why. Without that strong reason for your why, your sad days are gonna see you having really low days. So today we're going to talk about how I've gone from being an engineer, a leader, and an advocate to being a co-founding CTO, what was involved, some of the challenges that I had along the way, and hopefully you can learn from my journey. So one of the things I continually heard from many of the people that were within my community was that they wanted to progress and they didn't know how. We were hearing it over and over. It was so prevalent that many of the community organizers would have a bit of a rant about this. And we saw an opportunity for change. We saw an opportunity and something we were really passionate about. We wanted to change the whole tech industry. So my company Kaleida brings together 3 passionate female engineers with a determination to build more inclusion and diversity within the tech industry. And that we found that as we continue to build that, it lifts the boat for everybody. How do startups work? So you have an idea, and you have an amazing team that you trust who are also passionate about this idea. So immediately you should go out and found a startup, right? Go down into your basement, start hacking and grinding away every weekend. I am sure a few of you are nodding here. It's obvious, let's just build the thing and people will come and do it, and that works, right? No, nope, not really. Ideas are great. Please go and have more ideas, but let's test them. So how do we test these ideas? Well, the easiest and quickest way is to start with a conversation. Oh my God, so many conversations. Startup ideas are just like any experiment. I'm sure that many of you are running experiments within your organization. You have a hypothesis, and ours was that companies are interested in improving the quality of their teams and improving the gender diversity within those teams, and that they're going to do that with a career growth framework, and that they don't want to build their own, and that they're going to pay us money to do it for them. And we went and talked to many people. We talked to developers, we talked to engineers, managers. We went to small companies, big companies, friends and critics. We took mock-ups. There are so many ways that you can validate your ideas, and talking is just one of them. But what were we looking for here? We were looking for the no's, because If you can quickly prove that your idea is not going to work, you can put it down, go back to building your Lego and having fun. So what happened with the outcome of those conversations? Actually, we found that people were really passionate about what we were building. So many people loved this idea, and they saw value in it, and they wanted it, and they were even saying, hey, how can I have one? Crap. No Lego for us. We had a viable startup idea, so we now had a team, a validated idea, time to officially found our startup. Now, just for transparency, the time frame that we're talking about is a couple of weeks. Startup life moves very quickly. So what's the first thing you do when you have a startup? You go and get some merch and you lock in your domain name. Okay. Now, engineers in the room, time to build. Right? No. So I'm sure, as many of you know, when it comes to experiments, we're trying to build the smallest things possible to put into someone's hands. We had validated our idea, but you don't stop there. You don't stop with validating it once. You want to keep doing this again and again. And within those conversations that we had been having during that first phase, and within my co-founder Michelle's brain, we had enough ideas and content to go away with multiple teams and build for multiple years. Unfortunately, we didn't have multiple teams. We didn't have multiple years. We were doing this on our weekends, in our evenings. And we had to really, really cut it down to what's the smallest possible thing that we could build, put into users' and customers' hands so that we could keep learning. And this was it. We built a spreadsheet. So much of our ideas were around content. And we could have gone away and built the shiniest app. We could have built an amazingly complex serverless architecture. We could have spent months and months building this, and we would have deployed it and released it, and it would have been an absolute bomb because we hadn't nailed our fundamentals. Fortunately for us, we had an amazing cohort of early testers who gave us very deep and exhaustive feedback. I don't know if you get a lot of feedback. Sometimes it can be a little brutal too. But that allowed us to keep pivoting and moving forward and learning and running those experiments. So yet again, we proved our idea had legs. So as always in a startup with your experiments, even in your product world, always be thinking, what's the smallest possible thing that you can build and put together and put into someone's hands that you can learn from? So we've been continually validating our idea at this stage. I'm going to say we were probably about at the end of a first month. Now, when I say a month, I'm talking about a month of our spare time. And we had validated this idea had legs, that people liked it, that they wanted it, that the content was great, but we hadn't yet validated that someone was willing to give us money for it. So it was now onto our next MVP, which I always call a minimum sellable prototype. Because you can have an amazing idea, you can have a beautiful product, but without a customer that is willing to pay for it, you have a volunteer job, not a business. And I already have a volunteer job, as many of the people here do with their communities. So all along the way during our conversations, we had been asking people, what would you need in order to buy this? And again, we applied the smallest possible slice principle. But this time we're thinking about the lens of a paying customer. Okay, so I constantly would get this from my product managers when I was working in organizations, and they're like, can I have it next week, super cheap, and can it be awesome? And I'm like, no. We all know that this is not possible. So here I was with my startup saying, actually, can I have all three? Luckily, I'm not foolish enough to think that I can. Let's be honest. As a startup, we're settling on fast and cheap. We haven't yet validated that this is a sellable product, and we don't. If we have to compromise on something, we're going to be compromising on goods. But I'm an engineer. I know what happens when you start throwing prototypes into production, when you start taking on tech debt. Tech debt is fine, but the time range is what's important. You can take on tech debt as a startup, but you don't want your tech debt to be starting to slow you down from day one. 3 to 6 months, okay, but not day one. When you do, this starts to happen. It looks like if you start to compromise on your quality and it is a terrible build and you've just thrown a prototype into production, which is what many startups do, immediately you start to find that every feature and change takes you longer and longer to make. And one of the things that we know about startups, you're constantly learning, you're constantly pivoting, you're constantly trying to adapt to feedback, either from customers or from your sales prospects. This is not a sustainable lead time to change model for a developer, and it certainly does not make for a happy CTO. Okay, we know what we want and we know what we don't want. Let's have a quick look in the toolbox. In my toolbox, I have 3 technical co-founders, a ton of AWS experience, and we're all full stack. It's a pretty good looking toolbox. But I started to realize what was missing. As a full stack developer, I quickly realized what was not in my toolbox, and that was all of my teams and my specialists and all of those pre-built tools that had existed in the product companies I had been working in. Every time I'd been building something in the past couple of years, I had been working with bunches of people who were really strong in different areas. I had Linda, my front-end guru, Karen, my design extraordinaire, and Doug, my DevOps fiend. Tons of tools had been pre-built for me. We had pipelines and style guides and monitoring tools, and everything just worked. Crap, there is a lot to do when you are starting from scratch. Startups are so very scary. I love DevOps, but I definitely know that I didn't want to be spending my time and my effort building, running containers, managing complex infrastructure, having difficult deployments, worrying about RDS instances, stack isolation, like Jeremy mentioned. And as I was sitting there with an empty GitHub repo, I realized that I wanted to be focusing on experimenting with my fictional customers and finding my product market fit, not on managing all of this complex, non-business value adding pieces. Usually as a greenfield project, it's a great opportunity to work with the newest and shiniest tech, but that's not what I wanted to do right now. So one of the things I was really starting to realize was this didn't feel like the way. So in the startup ecosystem, everyone talks about these no-code tools. And usually when people go to their next MVP, this is what they use to build it. So we decided to follow the crowd. We spent a week spiking out what we could do with them. So we dabbled with Airtables, because our MVP had been a spreadsheet. We played with Bubble to get some data in, and we were working with Power BI to produce reports. And it was really quick to get something up and running. But we found as soon as we were starting to refine it, we were really running into trouble. I'm sure most of you know, once you start building your screens and your wireframes and your user workflows and your dashboards, you start to find all of these little niggly transitions that you hadn't thought of. You start to wanting to polish your application as you get it ready to give to customers. And I started to find that I was spending all of my time hunting through Power BI to try and find where to change the color of objects or how to shift my labels by like 2 pixels. It was really easy to put something together, but it was really hard to polish something. And we really wanted to have something polished enough for that first paying customer. As we further went down this path, big changes were becoming little changes. And we've said earlier, this was not what we wanted. So again, this didn't feel like the way. I was getting really frustrated by this point, and I really had a table flip moment. I said, I have spent years learning how to build things. I'm an engineer. Why am I beating my head against the wall and reading some really, really terrible docs to learn how to use tools that will write code for me when I know how to write code? These tools are great, and they help so many people out there get something done and out into production. And when they match your use case, they're fabulous. But they're not without a learning curve, they're not without their drawbacks, and you know what? They weren't a great fit for me. For what I was trying to do and the skills I had, they didn't match. I wanted something that would let me go fast, and that was writing code. So startups are a constant pivot, and we didn't lose the time with that experimentation. It took us about a week to figure, no, we're not going that way. All right, back to my toolbox and my empty GitHub repository. So serverless. This to us was obvious. I was going to write some code. It was going to be in AWS. We have startup budget, so I wasn't provisioning anything, especially not an OpenSearch cluster. We were going to use Lambda, Dynamo, S3. Really, really basic stuff. It's simple, it's easy, it's quick, we knew it, and it should cost us nothing on a regular basis. But there's a lot to do, and we still hadn't solved those initial fears that we'd been having that had stopped us leaping straight into writing code. Surely, there was another way. I wasn't loving the no-code life. I didn't have the resources or the team to have the all-code life. So I wanted a middle ground. I wanted helping hands. And luckily, there are some amazing souls out there in the community who are trying to make my life and your life as developers much better. They make frameworks, packages that abstract away those annoying friction points. I'm not a TypeScript rockstar, which is what we were using in our Lambdas. And so I asked around with my friends, and I told them what my challenges and fears were, and they said, hey, I think I've got something that you might want. Enter the serverless framework. So it's one of my current favorite things. It is very hard for me to explain to people and to Google for. It is serverless, the framework, or the concept, or the thing, not serverless, the concept. I know naming is hard, but really. For us, it's treat works in AWS. I heard rumors it works on other clouds as well. Mileage may vary. Now, there is a paid offering by the folks from serverless. I can't talk much to it. We don't use it. Everything that I'm going to show you up here was leveraged through the serverless framework CLI, which is free to use. So, why serverless? Why am I up here talking to you about it? Because it takes away those developer experience pain points. So I can write CloudFormation. A few people might laugh here. I'm not great at it, and I find it repetitive and annoying and difficult to debug. I'm notorious for getting to add an action to my IAM policy and wondering why my thing can't talk to the other thing. But serverless has a lovely set of functions that will define all my AWS infra for me. And I can tell it to attach the permissions, and it attaches the right permissions. I pass my references backwards and forwards in props in code, and it allows me to put my references into my environment variables and just access them. So with it, I suddenly had simple, readable, easy to change infrastructure as code. That made me happy. So what's the other thing I keep tripping over with serverless and developing in Lambdas is that developer feedback loop. So Jeremy talked about it. You write code, you deploy your code to your personal cloud, you test your code, i.e. you invoke your Lambdas, you wait for the CloudWatch logs to populate, and then you find out why your code didn't work. That's a really, really slow feedback cycle, and it's not enjoyable. When I use serverless, what it does instead, when I run it from my local terminal, it pushes my code up to the cloud, it deploys all my infrastructure for me, it also deploys a debug stack with it. That debug stack opens a WebSockets connection back to my local machine. So all of a sudden, when I hit my API gateway and invoke my Lambda function, it will proxy that request back to my local machine. All of a sudden, I'm running in the cloud, but I'm executing against the code that is running on my machine. So I am now making changes, hitting save, testing them, and watching what happens immediately. It may seem like a very small thing, but being able to save, test, and see the outcome immediately means that you spend less time fluffing around and more time writing code and debugging code and just getting on with your job. Ooh. There is another really, really cool feature that happens to be when you're using the dashboard, is it just puts a nice little wrapper around all of the commonly used things like your Dynamo, your Cognito, your API gateway. Instead of having multiple tabs open in AWS, I can just see what's happening and invoking locally. Again, it's just the little things. So one of my biggest frustrations with serverless has always been my lack of debugger. The typical workflow would often be that you would make a change, you'd execute your code, and unknown.blar is not a function. You're like, oh, why? Okay, drop in a console.log, what is my object? You get an object printed out. Okay, go back, console.log, JSON, stringify my object. Okay, now I see what my object is. Because the code's running on my local machine, I can now attach my debugger to it. So I can hit my Lambda, it'll proxy back to my machine, and then I will drop a breakpoint in my code, and it will allow me to start stepping through my code. For complex objects and complex functions, this allows me to quickly develop and move on. Console.log is great, but it's just not a debugger. Anything that helps me develop quicker and improve my feedback loop, improves my developer experience, and lets me move on with my job. Jeremy talked about it, stack isolation. I call them stages or environments. I think you get this out of the box with good infrastructure as code, but it's just amped up to the next level. I can't talk about serverless, both the concept and the framework, without talking about the amazing power it unlocks to be able to run all of your experiments. All of our developers have got their own environments, they have their own stacks. We don't deploy and overwrite and share stacks. And we also found that with good infrastructure as code, the use of stages, I'm able to deploy up an experiment and put it in the hands of my customers immediately. So I have multiple environments running in the cloud at any one time for different people with different types of code running on it. It allows me to start getting feedback really easily. Why that's amazing with serverless, because unless you're using OpenSearch, serverless, especially with the stack we're using, which is all about only using non-provisioned items, it means that our cost and complexity is only scaling by our usage, not by the environment numbers. So I don't care how many environments I'm running in production at any one time, my costs aren't going up exponentially. That, as a startup, matters. Okay. Whew. So with all that, let's put that all together. So serverless has given me the ability to go fast and cheap and also not terrible. All of a sudden, I have the flexibility to be able to develop, run experiments, get fast feedback loops, and focus on delivering really great outcomes to my customers, not about fluffing around with infrastructure as code, complex deployment pipelines, and all of those other things that were really worrying me at the start. And what does that translate to in terms of business outcomes? Because that matters in startups. A year later, we are still here, still alive, and we have managed to build up a minimum sellable product that's not just one, but 3 modules. We've got well over 100 users and commercial customers on it. For a startup, that's pretty fucking awesome. Our experiments and our pivots paid off. Those conversations and testing were really done. It never stops. You never stop learning. We're still building. We're still learning. So the thing I really wanted to tell you all here, whether it's with startups or with your own, no-code tools are great. Coding is also fabulous. If you've spent years learning how to do this amazingly powerful thing, leverage it when it matters. And thank you for listening to my journey.
Thank you, Susan. That's awesome. Alrighty. If you have any questions for Susan, I'm happy to run with a mic because we have a couple of minutes.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I want to know what the product actually does.
Thank you for asking that question. So we build career growth frameworks for organizations. We believe that a career growth framework demystifies the skills that are needed to thrive and grow within your organization, especially as an engineer.